If you have ever wondered how quickly a house can go from feeling like a sanctuary to feeling like a battlefield, then stay with me, because this is not just a story about wealth or loss, or even betrayal. It is a story about the quiet kind of courage that doesn't wear a suit or stand at podiums, but shows up in kitchens and living rooms, in the spaces where children learn whether the world is safe or not. Daniel Whitmore built his empire out of steel beams and abandoned factories, turning crumbling industrial blocks across Ohio into thriving commercial centers, and by the time he was 53, people described him as disciplined, visionary, relentless. What they didn't see was the grief that followed him home every evening like a second shadow. 4 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, Elise, and the house that once rang with her laughter had fallen into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Their daughter, Sophie, had been only 9 when she stood beside her father at the funeral, clutching his hand with a strength that felt too mature for her small fingers. Sophie had inherited her mother's golden brown curls and her thoughtful hazel eyes. But after losing Elise, something in those eyes changed. Childhood softened into caution. She spoke more quietly. She watched more carefully. Loss had taught her that love could vanish without warning, and she carried that lesson like fragile glass inside her chest. Daniel tried to be everything at once: father, mother, provider, protector. But grief and board meetings do not coexist easily. There were nights when he returned home late, exhausted from negotiations and deadlines, only to find Sophie asleep on the couch waiting for him. School books scattered around her, and guilt would tighten around his ribs like a vice. That was when Elena Morales entered their lives. Elena was 46, originally from Peru, with gentle eyes and a laugh that carried warmth even on the coldest mornings. She had come to the country years earlier to build a better future for her own son, who was now grown and living independently, and she took pride in honest work. Officially, she was hired as a housekeeper. Unofficially, she became the heartbeat of that quiet home. Elena noticed the small things others missed: the way Sophie hesitated before speaking about her mother, the way she carefully preserved Elise's old scarves in a drawer, the way she flinched at raised voices even in movies. Elena never tried to replace Elise. Instead, she honored her memory, inviting Sophie to share stories while they kneaded dough in the kitchen or watered the garden in the backyard. She taught Sophie how to braid sweetbread the way her grandmother once had, how to find comfort in routine, how to recognize that grief and joy can sit side by side without canceling each other out. To Sophie, Elena wasn't the help. She was safety. She was the steady presence that reminded her she mattered. Daniel saw the bond forming and felt grateful beyond words. For the first time since Elise's passing, he believed his daughter might grow up whole rather than fractured. But loneliness has a way of disguising itself as urgency, and Daniel, worn thin by single fatherhood and corporate demands, convinced himself he needed companionship sooner rather than later. That was how he met Claire Davenport at a fundraising gala downtown. Claire was elegant, poised, and effortlessly charming. She spoke confidently about art and travel and philanthropy, and she listened intently when Daniel talked about his business ventures. To an outsider, they looked perfectly matched: successful, sophisticated, polished. At first, Claire's presence felt like a balm to Daniel's loneliness. She laughed at his jokes. She praised his work ethic. She spoke kindly about Elise, or at least she did when he was in the room. But Elena noticed something that unsettled her. Whenever Daniel stepped away to take a call or greet another guest, Claire's warmth cooled. Her eyes lingered on Sophie with something unreadable impatience, perhaps, or irritation. The smiles felt rehearsed. The compliments sounded hollow. Sophie felt it too. Children often sense what adults try to ignore. She began retreating into her room when Claire visited. She grew quiet at dinner, pushing food around her plate. One afternoon, as Elena folded laundry beside her, Sophie whispered in a voice so soft it almost dissolved into the air, "She looks at me like I'm a problem." Alana's heart tightened, but she kept her tone calm and reassuring. "You are never a problem," she told her firmly. "You are a blessing. Anyone who cannot see, that is the one with the problem." Sophie nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. The turning point came on a bright Thursday afternoon. Daniel had been called unexpectedly into a meeting with investors. Something about zoning permits that couldn't wait. He kissed Sophie on the forehead before leaving and promised he'd be home for dinner. Not long after his car pulled away, Claire arrived unannounced, using the spare key Daniel had given her weeks earlier. Elena was in the kitchen slicing fruit when she heard raised voices from the living room. Sophie's voice trembled. Claire's tone was sharp, stripped of pretense. Elena moved quickly down the hallway, her instincts already on alert. What she saw made her blood run cold. Sophie stood near the couch with tears streaking her cheeks. A small suitcase open at her feet, the same pale blue one Elise had bought for her before a family vacation years ago. Claire stood over her in a fitted crimson dress, her expression hardened into something cruel. "You're old enough to understand," Claire was saying coldly. "Your father deserves a fresh start. You're a reminder of the past. You're in the way." Sophie shook her head, clutching the handle of the suitcase as if it were an anchor. "Dad wouldn't want me to leave," she whispered. Claire's lips curved into a thin smile. "You don't know what your father wants." That was when Elena stepped fully into the room. She placed herself between Claire and Sophie without hesitation, her posture steady, her voice calm but unyielding. "You will not speak to her that way," she said. Claire's eyes narrowed. "This is none of your business," she snapped. "You're an employee." Elena did not raise her voice. "Yes," she replied softly. "I am an employee. I am here to care for this home and this child, and I will not allow cruelty inside these walls." Claire laughed dismissively. "You think Daniel will choose you over me?" Elena met her gaze without blinking. "I think he will choose his daughter." Behind her, Sophie clung to Elena's apron, her small hands trembling. Claire's voice dropped into a hiss. "You could lose your job over this." Elena's answer came without pause. "I can find another job." She cannot find another childhood. The tension in the room thickened until another voice cut through it from the doorway. "What's going on?" Daniel had returned early, a canceled meeting bringing him home sooner than expected. He took in the scene in seconds. The suitcase, Sophie's tear-streaked face, Elena's protective stance, Claire's flushed anger. The truth assembled itself before anyone could construct a lie. Sophie ran to him, burying her face in his chest. "I didn't want to make you sad," she sobbed. Daniel's arms tightened around her. "You could never make me sad for being you," he said, his voice breaking. He looked up at Claire, disappointment replacing confusion. "Is this what you think of my daughter?" Claire attempted to explain, to soften her words, but the moment had already shifted beyond repair. Daniel's expression hardened, not in fury, but in clarity. "I think it's time for you to go," he said quietly. Claire searched his face for hesitation and found none. "Daniel," she began. He interrupted her with one final word. "Leave." She gathered her purse and walked out without another glance. The door closed with a sound that felt like the end of something fragile and false. Silence settled over the house, broken only by Sophie's quiet sobs. Daniel knelt down to meet his daughter at eye level. "I am so sorry," he whispered. "I should have seen this sooner." Sophie shook her head. But he continued, "Your happiness is not negotiable." Then he stood and faced Elena. Gratitude and shame flickered across his face. "Thank you for protecting her," he said. Elena simply nodded. That is what family does. In the months that followed, life rearranged itself into something steadier. Daniel adjusted his schedule, delegating more responsibilities at work, coming home earlier, attending school events he once would have missed. He listened more carefully. He asked more questions. Elena was no longer referred to as staff, but as part of the household. Her salary increased, but more importantly, Her role was openly acknowledged and respected. Sophie began laughing again, the sound filling rooms that had long felt hollow. Years passed, and the memory of that afternoon became a quiet reminder of how easily trust can be misplaced and how powerfully it can be restored. On her 18th birthday, Sophie sat on the back porch with Daniel and Elena as the sun dipped below the horizon. "I want to study social work," she announced. "I want to help kids who feel like they don't belong." Daniel felt pride swell in his chest. Elena squeezed Sophie's hand gently, eyes shining. Because sometimes strength doesn't arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the steady voice that says no when cruelty demands silence. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that kindness and courage still matter, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and stay with us for more stories that prove real heroes often stand quietly in kitchens and living rooms, choosing love over fear every single day.